ba ma dalee commencé liggéey bi yokkute bu bari am nañ ko ci.
On Sky News, coming up on today's programme, Cambo on pause. Is the controversial North Sea oil field dead in the water after Shell's pullout? Concern for species at the bottom of the ocean as regulations to allow deep-sea mining come under consideration. And McDonald's opens its first net-zero restaurant in the UK, but has to fend off accusations of greenwashing. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with the solutions. Now, the future of the controversial Cambo oil field project is in doubt tonight after the company behind it pressed the pause button. It comes a week after Shell, which had a 30% stake in Cambo, walked away. Well, today, the main developer, Sycamore Point Energy, said it can't now go ahead on the original timescale and it's evaluating its next steps. Critics have long argued that developing North Sea oil projects is incompatible with the UK's aims to phase out fossil fuels and achieve net zero. Well, despite those reservations, news began to emerge during the summer that the UK was set to sign off on the new oil field northwest of Shetland. Now, soon after, environmental activists started a petition calling on the UK government to block it. After previously saying it was a matter for the Westminster government, Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon then wrote to Boris Johnson in August asking him to reassess Cambo's licence. At COP26 at the beginning of November, the issue of whether Cambo should go ahead was brought up repeatedly by campaigners and politicians. At the end of last month, Ms Sturgeon told MSPs she didn't think the oil field should be given the green light as it wouldn't pass climate assessments. Now, this was the first time that the First Minister had publicly spoken out against the project. Then just last week, Shell announced that it was pulling out of its 30% investment in Cambo, which led to today's decision from the main developers, Sycamore Point Energy, that they're pausing work on the project. Well, Sky's Aisha Zahid is here with me now. So, Aisha, what does this latest step mean for the future of the Cambo project?
Well, the Cambo oil field has always been hugely controversial, and this decision to pause the project means its future is looking more uncertain, but it doesn't write it off completely. Sycamore Point Energy, the firm behind the project, say they've paused it to evaluate the next steps. In a statement, they've said, "We continue to believe Cambo is a robust project that can play an important part of the UK's energy security, providing homegrown energy supply and reducing carbon-intensive imports whilst supporting a just transition." Now, the Cambo oil field was widely discussed at COP26 by activists and by politicians. The hopes were it would help create a secure homegrown energy supply and jobs. But activists raised concerns that hundreds of ocean species would be affected. So this news is going to be welcomed by all those campaigners. In a statement, Greenpeace said the economics of the Cambo oil field were looking decidedly shaky and the climate maths never did make sense. Both the Westminster and Scottish government now need to end support for new oil and gas infrastructure. They should urgently deliver a just transition to clean energy, providing the money, policy and training to ensure the communities who have relied on the oil industry can move to the green jobs of the future. So the future of the Cambo oil field looking uncertain, but ultimately the final decision will lie in the hands of the UK government.
Aisha, thanks very much indeed. Now, the International Seabed Authority has been meeting in Jamaica this week to discuss regulations which would allow the mining of cobalt, nickel and other metals that could help the energy transition towards renewables. They're elements that are used to build the batteries to power electric cars and to store wind and solar energy. But despite the seemingly green credentials, marine biologists are concerned about the impact on deep sea biodiversity. Now, one vast and as yet unexploited resource is the deep sea bed, the ocean floor, thousands of metres under the water. Now, one such area is the Clarion-Clipperton zone in the Pacific. Now, the seabed there is some 4,000 metres below the ocean's surface. Now, that's as deep as some of the tallest mountains in the Alps are high. Now, the area holds trillions of polymetallic nodules. These are potato-sized deposits loaded with manganese, cobalt and other precious ores. But while the minerals are valuable, less is known about the ecosystem at such depths. Now, many unknown species are believed to live in the darkness, and recent studies have indicated that mining the bed is likely to lead to widespread biodiversity loss and extinction. Well, Dr. Diva Amon is a leading marine biologist, deep-sea mining expert and a signatory to a letter signed by more than 600 experts calling for a pause to deep-sea mining. So welcome to you. I know that Greenpeace has been protesting against this just today, but what about you? How worried are you about the prospect of deep-sea mining?
Yeah, I'm very worried. You know, this is an industry that, if it moves forward, will create irreversible loss of biodiversity and function. I mean, you're going to be killing animals by grinding them up on the seafloor, especially as many are actually attached to the minerals that are being mined. And it'll create huge plumes of dust, almost not dust. It'll create huge plumes that are akin to toxic dust storms and noise and light pollution on a scale never seen before. And this is a massive scale. That area, the Clarion-Clipperton zone, is the size of the contiguous USA. And this is, of course, as you said already, a part of the planet that we know so little about and is the closest to pristine wilderness on Earth. And unfortunately, you know, we currently have, in my opinion, an inadequate and conflicted regulator and a profound lack of science to really move this industry or guide this industry in the future.
Well, yes, tell us just how much we do know then about the biodiversity at that depth and how important it could be in mitigating against climate change, how much carbon rather is stored there, for example. I mean, presumably it's very hard to do the research when it's so far down.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a really tough place to do the research. I mean, it's very different to walking around a grassland or snorkeling on a coral reef. This requires time, this requires high-tech equipment and high levels of expertise. I mean, often we will spend months out at sea, plus many years in the lab after that, just to be able to understand, you know, an area that is just a few square kilometers. So it's going to take likely years, if not decades, to be able to have the information that we may need to manage this industry, again, if it does move forward. But you asked about the biodiversity. I mean, this is an incredible part of the planet, but one that, you know, we know so little about. I like to say that we have, you know, a handful of pixels of information if we consider the deep sea to be a giant television screen. You know, and it's not just complex questions that we can't answer. It's the most basic questions that we're talking about. Questions about, you know, just what lives there? How old do these animals live to? What role do they play in these ecosystems? But we do know some things. We know that, you know, there are just hundreds of thousands of species in the deep ocean. There are glowing sharks. There are snails that grow metallic armor. And there are corals that are amongst the oldest animals on the planet, living for thousands of years.
Sorry to interrupt, but just very quickly, those in favour of doing this will say this is actually good for the planet. These are minerals that can be really useful in batteries for solar power, for electric cars. It's worth doing.
Yeah, so I think the question is, at what risk, right? This is a part of the planet. The deep sea is essential for keeping us alive through climate regulation by absorbing carbon and by absorbing heat and sequestering carbon. You know, we know that the ocean and the deep ocean is already acting as a natural buffer and helping to regulate our climate. And the deep sea mining will unfortunately add much more stress to an already stressed ocean. And that could push us to a tipping point where it could cease to function as it already does. And that could mean limiting our ability to deal with climate change in itself.
Well, Dr. Diva Amon, very interesting to get your take on it. Thanks very much indeed for joining us today.
Thank you.
Now let's take a look at some of the other climate stories making the news today. And an already delayed biodiversity summit in China next spring is under threat due to stricter coronavirus travel restrictions. Nearly 200 countries are set to finalise an agreement to safeguard plants, animals and ecosystems at the UN conference known as COP15 next May in the city of Kunming. A rapid spread of the Omicron variant of COVID-19 could see face-to-face talks delayed for a fourth time. McDonald's has opened its first UK net zero restaurant. The building is powered by on-site solar panels and wind turbines, insulated with British sheep's wool and cladded with recycled IT equipment and white goods. But some environmental campaigners have accused the fast food chain of greenwashing due to the amount of meat and dairy on the menu. A spokesperson for McDonald's says the restaurant was just one of the many actions they're taking as part of plans to achieve net zero across their UK and Ireland business by 2040. A conservation group has announced it plans to buy a stretch of Northern California coastline to protect it from logging. Save the Redwoods League has agreed to pay nearly $37 million to buy the land from a lumber company if it can raise the funds by the end of the year. The area is home to Roosevelt elk and mountain lions, which live in the forested hills, along with endangered species such as the northern spotted owl and Pacific fisher. Now, microalgae could play a significant role in a future circular economy. That's because, like trees, algae can naturally absorb carbon dioxide and turn it into oxygen, neutralising harmful greenhouse gas emissions. Now, one brewery in Sydney, Australia, has been working with scientists by using algae to reduce emissions from their fermentation process. But don't worry, the algae doesn't actually touch the beer.
No, there's not algae in the beer. The beer is unchanged. The algae is just part of the production process. It never touches the beer. The CO2 off the top of that beer basically runs through the hose, is captured in this balloon. This balloon then feeds CO2 into this compressor where it's compressed. Basically, the CO2 is then ingested by the microalgae that uses it to photosynthesize. That creates more algae, releases oxygen.
Algae capture CO2 up to 400 times more efficiently than a tree. It's just straight photosystems capturing carbon and turning it into biomass. So they're extremely efficient. They're probably the best organism to trap carbon.
Do stay tuned. Coming up after the break, I'll be joined by lecturer in international relations at Cardiff University, Jen Allan, and co-founder of the COP26 Climate Action Plan, Chidi Obihara. And we're going to be discussing the link between nature and climate change and how best to call out companies for greenwashing.
The Killer by Design is a book that tries to follow the history of the FBI profilers, of how they would go to a crime scene and be able to identify some of the behavioral aspects that might lead to a suspect. And this work was really profound because there was a lot of pushback then. People didn't understand necessarily what they were doing, but they carried on. They brought me in to try to come up with a methodology, if you will, where we could consistently look at 36 serial killers and try to identify those characteristics that were unique to them. Well, where you start with that is at a crime scene where you have a victim. That's really all you have. So victimology, or the study of the victim, is really what I brought to their work, because I have worked with rape victims here in Boston for about a year, trying to understand the trauma that they went through, but also how the offender had dealt with them. So that was what I brought. My background being a nurse, I was able to identify those kinds of behaviors that might be seen in the crime scene. I was interested in the psychology of patients, and I became interested in crime victims with my colleague who you see on the screen, Linda Lytle Holmstrom. We were both new professors at Boston College, and we wanted to study rape victims. The photo you see in there is the team. We believe strongly in a team. We had a research assistant, we had a detective, we had a psychologist, and you had me as a psychiatric nurse. We were quite surprised to learn how early some of these thoughts develop in the young child moving into adolescence when they start acting out these thoughts. That was why I got into this of how could we prevent more victims if we could identify the behavior earlier and pay attention to it and get them into treatment or some kind of safe surrounding so that they wouldn't go out and kill. That's absolutely the whole goal of the work.
Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. And we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day now with lecturer in international relations at Cardiff University, Jen Allan, and co-founder of the COP26 Climate Action Plan, Chidi Obihara. So very good evening to both of you. Nice to see you both. So first of all, we spent much of the year talking about the COP26 Climate Summit in Glasgow, which happened, of course, last month. But another UN meeting due to take place in Kunming in China is now in danger of being delayed for the fourth time due to the rapid spread of the latest COVID variant. At stake is a deal to safeguard ecosystems. So are we in danger of forgetting the importance of biodiversity? Chidi, what do you think? How important is it that this Kunming summit goes ahead, do you think?
The Kunming Summit is pivotal. The fact that it's been postponed again, even after it was made primarily online last year, kind of gives everybody the impression that the ambitions that we have for biodiversity have frankly crashed through the floor. We can't allow the broader issue of how our ecosystems function to be overshadowed by politics, convenience, and a tendency to focus on the headline issues of carbon rather than the broader natural systems within.
Chidi, your line just froze there for a moment. I'm going to move over to Jen, but I will come back to you and hopefully it'll revive itself. But Jen, do you agree with that? I mean, the world hasn't done brilliantly on meeting biodiversity targets that were set in Japan in 2010. So how important is this summit and what does need to be done?
The summit is very important. It's as important as Glasgow. It's as important as any other major meeting where countries set rules for themselves that they have to follow. They didn't do a great job the last time. They set rules and targets for nature. They didn't fully meet any of the targets. So Kunming is very important. It will go ahead. It'll be postponed, partly because there was a meeting that's supposed to happen before the COP. It was postponed because of worries about Omicron. And there has to procedurally be a bit of time between that meeting and the COP. So Kunming, I think, is still very much on the cards, still going to happen. It's just a bit of a delay, hopefully just for procedural reasons.
And Chidi, expand a little bit more on why you think it's important to tackle both biodiversity and climate change together.
Thank you very much for that. Biodiversity is the broader picture. It's our ecosystem, it's our home, it's our planet. It's the very land we stand on, the air we breathe. The decarbonisation priorities of the COP process are a subset of biodiversity. So if we don't get biodiversity right, we can't get carbon sequestration right in a holistic, continuous and sustainable way. Even though COP26 gets all the headlines, the actual broader natural systems in which we sit deserve just as much or maybe even more attention.
Chidi, your system is teasing us. We're getting dramatic pauses occasionally, but we are getting the gist of what you're saying. Jen, very briefly, is it easier in some ways for people to relate to the whole nature issue than climate change?
I think so. We walk through nature, we see nature, we hear nature. It's all around us all the time. The climate system is invisible in a way. You know, we sort of get inklings here and there and hints that maybe the climate's changing, but it's often in numbers and models and figures. But nature, we know. You know, we have a deep connection with nature going back to poetry and stories from our ancestors way, way back. So I think people do understand the need to protect nature and they get behind that sort of action.
OK, let's move on to our other subject, shall we? Because McDonald's has opened its first UK net zero restaurant today, but the chain, which relies heavily on meat and dairy, has been accused of greenwashing. It says the restaurant is just one part of its net zero plans. But whatever the merits of one company's plans, isn't the very fact that the private sector is attempting to go carbon neutral helpful for the planet? So, Chidi, let's talk very generally, shall we? Should we be encouraged that companies are increasingly wanting to be part of the climate change conversation and want to be seen to be green?
Thank you very much for that. Well, I think the fact that so many large companies are very publicly pivoting towards net zero is an indication that we've won the argument. It's an indication that environmentalists are being proven to have been right all along. But as they join our side of the argument, they need to be exact, they need to have plans that are functionally correct, and it's very, very important that their transition plans are managed by their operations, not their marketing departments. So McDonald's can have great adverts with good-looking artists and beautiful young children, but if they don't take care of their supply chain, if they don't make sure that they responsibly source the things that we eat, if they don't make sure that they don't encourage farmers to destroy the ecosystems and farm in unsustainable ways, at the end of the day, they still contribute to the problem, and that has to change.
Jen, would you agree with that? I mean, is transparency at the heart of this, and how much do we have at the moment?
We don't have much transparency at all at the moment when it comes to net zero plans, especially by private corporations. It's very rare to see any sort of published statements about what they're including in their accounting, how much they're going to reduce their emissions, how much they're going to offset. And if a whole bunch of companies are thinking of offsetting, well, that means we're going to need countries the size of Brazil to just be forests, only for a company maybe like Shell. So we need to know, in terms of planning, what countries or what companies are going to do in order to have any hope of figuring out if these net zero pledges are realistic. So the Secretary General has an effort underway. He announced at the Glasgow Climate COP that he's going to bring together some experts to start thinking about what legitimate net zero pledges and plans look like. And that could be a soft mechanism that really would have a bit of teeth to it in terms of all these companies using the UN as a platform to make these kinds of announcements.
Chidi, finally, do you have some optimism that companies are moving in the right direction?
We are seeing a move in the right direction, but there are exceptions. And as Jen very rightly pointed out, Shell, for example, were focused on an op-ed in The Guardian just 48 hours ago, where they said the operational plans, outlook, budget and pricing assumptions that they had given the public did not reflect their net zero plans. So we're in a world where corporations are stating one thing and doing something completely different. And that's not right. What we need is an alignment between the stated goals of these corporations and their actual operational actions.
Right, Chidi Obihara, thank you for persevering, even though your line was a little bit dodgy, but we got the gist of all of what you were saying. And Jen Allan, thanks both very much indeed. Well, that's everything from us for this week. Do stay tuned, because coming up next on Sky News tonight, new restrictions in Scotland, where the First Minister warns of a tsunami of COVID cases. That's all coming up in the next few minutes, but do stay with us for the Daily Climate Show next week. Thanks for watching. See you next time.